Well, afternoon, everybody. My name is Laura Keogh. I work in DFT. I work in the Joint Air Quality Unit, which is joint with DEFRA. I'm also on the Project Delivery Profession Board, and I'm the sort of Project Delivery rep for Roads, Places and Environment Group. So this event this afternoon is part of our Project Delivery Community of Practice events. And I'm really delighted to introduce Dr. Naomi Stanford, who's going to be leading the session for us today. So Naomi is a leading expert in organisational design and effectiveness. She's worked with a large range of multinational companies and is the author of several books as well. For the past 5 years, she's been working in the civil service and is advising the Department for International Trade on organisational design. So that was all I was going to say. I'll hand over to Naomi to take us through the session. Thank you.
And thanks everybody for being here. It's interesting the cultural attributes around meetings that we can reflect on in terms of registering for meetings, attending meetings, and what have you. I was at one this morning where I was doing a presentation, and the people in the room bore no relationship whatsoever to the invitation list or the acceptances, tentatives, and declines. So that was quite fun. So as Laura said, I have been in the civil service for 5 years, and I know that because I got a Tesco voucher for £25 from DWP. So I worked out that it's £5 a year, long service per year, or service per year, which I also thought was interesting, because some departments apparently don't give these vouchers. So there's a civil service difference, although we're supposed to be one civil service. So as you can see, I'm sort of constantly on the lookout for cultural indicators. And when we're running project teams, I think that's a really interesting point to start thinking about what is culture, because a project team is a culture within an existing culture and often working across other cultures, and that can be quite problematic. And I'm currently setting up a project team now, and we're working out who should be part of it and how we will develop that feeling of a project team when the team members are actually only doing the project as part of their day job. So there's a sort of potential clash there. So this talk will, I don't know how long it lasts because it depends how chatty we are, but it not beyond 4:15 or so. It's not going to go into midnight. I give this to the Project Leadership Academy, which is run at the moment out of DWP, and that's where I came across Gerard Kelly, who works here. Do you know Gerard? Yeah, some of you do. And Gerard thought it would be a great topic for you all to listen to. So that's why I arrived here. And unfortunately, Gerard can't be here this afternoon because he's suddenly got called away to an urgent something or other, which again is, you know, a cultural thing of how do you balance priorities and what's more important. So the purpose of this is to put project leadership in some form of cultural context. And I don't know, are you all project leaders of one type or another, or project members? Or yeah, okay. So if you start to think of yourself as you have a responsibility for developing a culture within your project team or across your project teams or in interfacing with other cultures, that is the sort of mindset for this session. And then the second purpose is to help you develop the project or organisational culture that you want. And I don't know how many people actually think about that in advance or as they're setting up a team. What kind of culture would we like to have, and how would we know when we've got it, and what are all the feelings around it? How many of you do think about that? You do, yeah, good. Yeah.
Maybe not in a sort of overt way, thinking about culture, but think about how I want people in the team to feel.
Okay, so so that's an interesting thing about feelings around culture. How do you feel about the culture? And often culture is equated with behaviours of one type or another. And the civil service is riddled with behavioural requirements of, the code of ethics, and then individual departmental values, and then project team values, and behaviours associated with each of those. And some of them are competing, and that can be quite interesting, of how the values or the behaviours required potentially compete. So that's the purpose. Any thoughts or questions of what you're expecting? Is this what you expected, more or less? Yeah. Okay. Right. So when you think about your role as a project leader, you've got three aspects of it usually, and we can debate these. A strategic aspect: what is the strategy of this piece of work that I'm doing? What direction do I need to set? A delivering results domain, and a building relationships domain. And they overlap at parts. And again, they can compete, like the strategic direction sometimes competes with the delivering results. So you may have a long-term strategy, but have to deliver short-term results. And the short-term results can compromise the long-term strategy, quite not necessarily often, but it does. Or the delivering results can interfere with building and sustaining relationships if you're putting too much pressure on people, or if they've got competing demands. So as in your project leadership role, you're thinking about those three aspects. And what's interesting, if you think about what happens, is you've got some cultural dimensions coming into those three domains. And then how you, as the project leader, manipulate those three domains starts to give you your own project team culture. So let's just pause there for a second. If you can pair up, which isn't going to work for the live stream, and just, so you could be a three. Think about those. Does that seem like a sensible definition of a project leader's kind of core domains of responsibility? And then put forward any comments. So just discuss it for a moment or two, as in groups of 2 or 3. And if you are listening in a live stream, you won't have anyone to interact with, but you can try it for yourself. Okay, let's take a look at this. And what I just realised is I asked you if you knew Gerard, and some of you did and some of you didn't, which now makes me think that you don't know each other. So maybe it would be a useful exercise before we look at this for us to introduce ourselves since it's a small group and say which bit we come from and why we're here and all that sort of thing. So who would like to begin? Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Well, Mark, we don't work in cyber security. I support security and resilience, looking at a project, the implementation of a European directive, regardless of Brexit.
Yeah, that's an interesting piece of area of work. Right, who's next?
I'm Rachel West, like Laura, I'm a project delivery ambassador, and I also sit on the DFT project delivery board, and I run the program and procurement excellence function at Science.
Okay, great.
Come up with some benefits for people like that.
Right. That's interesting. I used to work for British Airways on when the Terminal 5 was being built. And then during the move to Harmondsworth, that's included. So that whole thing was fascinating. Okay, who's next? Great, nice range of projects going on here.
I work in a cross-road food team, so we are looking to obviously having positions.
Yes. Oh, yes, interesting. Yeah. So you're spanning. Yeah, spanning two organisations. Yeah, that can be very problematic. Great, thank you.
I'm an employee that I'm here in a workshop from Northern Ireland government. I haven't done a project for probably a year and a half.
Excellent. How am I?
I'm Crystal Matthew. I'm an assistant project manager with the Northern Wales section. I'm new to DFT. I just started here last week.
Wow. Oh, welcome. Have you noticed cultural differences between the FCO and you?
I've come from reputation.
Right.
So there are more similarities.
Oh, okay, good. Right. Okay. That's a nice range of roles and projects and what have you, and a lot of challenges, I would imagine, around some of them. Okay, so now moving back to this slide, any comments on the project leader's role? Does it ring true-ish?
How you prioritize your time and things, and how this person tends to be a bit maybe get squeezed.
Oh, good point. Yeah.
If you're it's the relationship between two members,
That's a good point to note, that where you're pushing your energies as the project leader, and in what balance of time over a week or a month or a period of time, and is it getting skewed in any of those three directions? Because that does happen, and if you are in target setting sort of scenarios, that can lead to all sorts of, well, often dysfunctional behaviours. Okay, any other comments or thoughts on this slide?
I think the green, actually, the strategic direction, that very often gets squeezed because you get so into the day-to-day of doing and delivering and getting stuff done. And actually, it's where do you find the space?
Right, exactly.
To step back and think about, well, hang on, are we still heading strategically in the right direction? That's really hard to find the room to do that.
Yeah, I'm reading a really interesting self-help type book at the moment, which someone recommended to me, who is a project manager, called Superstructured. And it's a 31-day, but very easy to read, program of looking through your workload and seeing how to structure it more effectively. But one of the pieces is the setting strategic direction. And it's very fascinating because it's also got downloadable resources with it, and one of them, which I didn't print it off there because I didn't have time. One of the resources is you list your goals on the one side, and then you list what you're actually doing that day in the next column, and then you say, does this contribute to my goals? No, right, take it off then, that sort of thing. And it's a very interesting set of questions to ask around structuring.
So nice to be able to do
I know. Well, he's got a lot.
We work somewhere like here,
Yeah.
and some kind of organisational
Precisely.
descends in your head,
Yeah.
and you just have to walk.
That's right. Well, he's got answers to all of that.
This
So.
is good.
I thought it was worth £11, I think it was, to find all this out. Okay, any other questions on this? So now we're raising some good questions here about the different domains.
I think ultimately, where the theory goes, strategy is going to find your course of action,
Right.
and that's all the real world is such that you have to incorporate, for example,
That's right, yes.
What strategy are you talking about? I'm involved in it.
Right.
International,
yeah.
You know, so you have to lay the groundwork.
Yeah,
You
yes.
understand other strategic priorities. You have to mark out with the priorities at a
Right.
strategic level before you can actually, you know, if it's a truly effective strategy, when you deliver it, would be necessarily incorporated into the strategy.
Does, yeah.
At national level.
Yeah.
European level or European private sector.
Right. Yeah. Yes, it's immensely complex, and I think that often gets lost, and you feel adrift in that complexity quite often without recognizing the complexity. And I don't know if any of you saw a report from the National Crime Agency on serious and organised crime, because they did a sort of similar thing to what you're doing. They mapped the strategies of all the departments involved in serious and organised crime. There are 23 different departments, and they all have competing objectives. And how do you have a national crime strategy for serious and organised crime in that kind of landscape? Oh, did you? Yes. Okay. Yeah. Very, very complicated to work that out. They have produced a map that's worth looking at, because systems mapping is one way through that. So thank you for that. Ready to move on? So one of the points that is worth bearing in mind and thinking about is this totally standard statement that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and someone on this slide has added in lunch and dinner. And it is rather interesting when you start to think about your own organisational strategy. Is it achievable, or are aspects of your culture getting in the way of it? And the same holds true at project level and at all levels in between. How is your culture impacting your strategy? And so just bear that in mind, because you can see it quite often happening if you've got a label of cultural inertia or what have you, that is, you're not going to get something delivered. But before we go any further, let's just look at what we think organisational or project team culture is. So again, in small groups of 3 or 4 or 2 or whatever, just think whether you can add to this list of things which are generally considered cultural attributes. So the list so far reads beliefs, legacy, rules, symbols, styles, ways of interacting, history, values, and to have a colleague new to the organisation, some of them are probably highlighted. You know, why do you behave in such and such a way, or what are people noticing as you come in? That you forget as soon as you've been in the organisation a month or so. Right, so in your groups, just consider those.
Can I just ask people, if possible, could we move close to the centre, because the people that aren't tuned in are asking to be able to hear you more clearly when we are having some comments. If that's okay, most people okay, but just because the microphone's there.
Yeah, oh, the microphone's there. Yes, yeah. Let's all move up. Squish to the middle.
Sorry, we've got 10 people channeled in at the moment.
Oh, great, good. Okay, so people, I can't interact with them though, can I? I can't talk to and hear their
Can they
voices.
provide comments actually on the feed? I think they might be able to comment on.
We're
the
just going to check if the people on the live stream can add comments in, and then then you could participate as well.
So if they're logged in, I think they can actually add comments, and we can just.
Oh yeah, then
on the feed.
that's a good idea. Right. Okay. So then the people on the live stream, people are just talking to each other briefly on what are the aspects of organisational culture. Can someone on the live stream send in a comment and try the comment box? Okay, so Molly will send you a link. Send her an email. Okay, so let's look at these dimensions of culture. Any thoughts or questions or additions to the stars?
I mean, we thought that quite often your goals and objectives are different in government and outside government, such as obviously civil servants were focusing on delivering government's objectives as neatly as possible.
Oh, right. Right.
And quite often there's a barrier there. And we're focusing on different things. We want to deliver a project, but if the government want, whereas their focus is we're not focusing about what the government does. We just want to deliver a
Oh yeah, that's a really good one. I haven't heard that before. So one of your cultural attributes is the things we focus on. Yeah, very good. Yeah, that's an interesting new one which I haven't heard of, which is great. Yeah, because it does make a big difference. What you focus on is what's important in a culture. Yes, good. Other ads.
So I thought one could be standards that sort of find out numbers of things.
Yes.
As long as the acceptable standards for how you engage with how you respond to that.
Yes, that is a good one because it's different from behaviours. It's about the expectations around it. Yeah, good. Anything else? Working patterns, yes. And there's a huge amount of talk now about flexible working and shared jobs and that sort of thing. So working patterns is a good one. Anything else? Because some working patterns are acceptable or unacceptable, and there are norms of behaviour around that. Which? Accountability, yes. And that can be a cultural attribute of who is willing to take accountability and who wants to push it up to somebody else to take accountability. Or, you get the sort of statements about it's more than my job's worth to do something or other. And those are cultural statements as well. Language is a great one, yes. And I just read a very good blog by somebody or other who talks about the language of traditional organisations versus more tech-oriented newer organisations and comparing how very different they are. And that has got some fascinating contrasts in it. Language is, and when you're new, the language that you're expected to learn is. I remember when I first went to DWP, it was my first day, I went to a meeting on FED. And I thought, okay, I think I get this. And it was called Future Engage Deliver, which is a development program. And then I went to the very next meeting, literally the next meeting, and it was about FED. And I thought, how weird to have two meetings, one after the other about FED. And in the second meeting, I thought, I don't think this is about future engaged deliver. And then in the end, I had to ask someone what this FED stood for, and it was fraud, error, and debt. And so you've got an acronym that everybody is familiar with, but they're not explicable to newcomers if you don't know it. And we work a lot in acronyms in government. That might be a difference in your organisation between here and TfL. They have the same acronym for things which are completely different. The language is a good one. Okay, so we've got those types of things. So you start to think that culture is multifaceted and very complex. If you then start to think, well, how do people describe it? This is a very standard model of how organisation culture is sort of typified across research projects and what have you into culture. Johnson and Scholl's cultural web. And it's about the stories people tell, the symbols that they use, power structures that are in place, both formal and informal, the organisational structures like hierarchies or networks or whatever, the control systems, and you started to mention some of those around standards and performance measures and objectives and that kind of thing, and then the rituals and routines. And we're using this in the Department for International Trade, where I am now. We've just used this web to map the culture of DIT. And using the people survey, we did change rituals and routines to diversity and inclusion, because rituals and routines made people kind of curious. But there are rituals and routines, and you can see them at the times people do things. The symbols are very interesting, and I was trying, when I walked into here, I've never been in this building before, I was trying to work out whether I could see any symbols of the Department for Transport. And one of the things I instantly noted was that place by the reception desk where there's 6 foldable bicycle storage units, I took them to be, which I haven't seen in other government departments. And I thought that was a nice little indicator of we're interested in transport of various types. Although my first take on it was, why are they selling folding bikes? before I worked out it was a storage place. And one of the things, I don't know if you've been into Caxton House in DWP. If you walk in, well, you will have been. You walk in, on the left-hand side, there's pictures of the executive team. So there's 12 pictures or 8 pictures, a photo of each member. But the narrative around DWP is we want to be collaborative and inclusive and joined up and what have you. And when I was there, I countless times said, why don't we replace the 12 executive team members, the collage of 80,000 DWP employees on the wall, because that would be a symbol of inclusion and collaboration. But it didn't get anywhere. And that is a cultural disconnect. You're saying one thing and you're doing something else. And symbols are incredibly important. And in the Department for International Trade, in this cultural that I was just talking to you about, we were looking at symbols, and we've got a mantra of one DIT. And so in a group like this, somebody noticed that every single person in the room, which is a group about this size, had a different lanyard for their badge. But noticing yours, there's some similarities here. So that's quite good in terms of oneness, as it were. But in the group that we were in, they're completely different.
There's a few different ones.
Huh?
There's a few different ones.
Yes. Yeah. So. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So because they're a symbol of who your loyalty is at some level, or I don't know if you just accept them or think about them, but they are symbolic. What's yours? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So if you start to think about that web, your culture is the middle, the paradigm. And you can start to think. Now, in your case, you're thinking in, particularly in your case, multiple dimensions for your project, for TfL, for Department for Transport, but all of us will be thinking in more than one dimension, I think. So if you can take again in small groups, take the web that we're looking at and start to think, what are some of the signs of culture in your organisation from those 6 dimensions? And we've got a nice sort of range to choose from: visual, symbols, language, and things that people have suggested from this slide. Shall I leave any of these off?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, right. Did you manage to go through this? Right, let's take a look at this. Did anyone come up with dress code? Dress code, yes. Because it just struck me looking around the room that you look slightly more informal than DIT in your dress code. But I'm not sure if that's typically. Yeah.
Yeah, just for
Yeah. Right. Any other things that people thought about in any of these dimensions? Oh, power structures, yes, so it's about that. Yes. Yes, yes. And that's an interesting one for project teams, because project teams tend to be based around expertise rather than hierarchical power. And that can cause difficulties sometimes, because sometimes a junior person is more expert than a hierarchically powerful person. And particularly, I guess, in that sort of cyber IT tech area. Yeah, that's right, yes. And that can be quite difficult for people to accommodate if they're used to one type of culture and they're moving into that much more expert-based culture than positional power-based culture.
Yeah, it's funny. Horribly hierarchy. I'm just used to getting things right, telling people what they need.
So that's the difficulty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But people that are under 30 versus the ones who've been here a long time.
Right.
The ones that are, the younger ones are a lot more confident and they're quite happy to go for the more senior roles, certainly the ones
right.
The older generation in their roles. They've been in the same role for a lot longer periods of time. And they don't want to change.
Yes. And that's a very useful observation around sort of societal cultural norms of how you're expected in the wider society to think about working life and capability and expertise and things like that. And that, I mean, when I joined DWP, my first job in civil service, I was staggered by the hierarchy. You know. Yeah, I know. Yeah, yeah. Well, I heard hilarious stories about the job centres where they all had to be called Mr. and Mrs. and all that. But that can be really difficult, particularly if we're trying to recruit from multiple generations. And I think, again, in project teams, that is also a difficulty of that clash of expectations. And how you have conversations about that is
I think it was especially with the recruitment process. You get no time at all to have to follow that.
yes.
With the culture, and when these people get into senior roles, they expect everybody else to follow, and they're not very good at leading. So when they actually have to make the decisions, then they're a little bit lost. And they go through a couple of years of what I've noticed with finding their feet in a leadership position because they've never had to do it.
Yes, that's really astute observation. Again, that's my experience as well. And that the ability to make or take decisions is always passed over in a lot of cases. That making a fast decision is a difficult one. Any other thoughts? So we've had power. I've picked up dress code. What else? Or hierarchical power.
Talking a bit about how we have a weekly meeting with our director, that kind of it gives a very distinct feel to the people because every week directors involved directly.
Right.
Yeah, which is different.
Oh yes, okay. So that's introducing a ritual of a weekly team meeting. And one of the things, again, in DWP we did when we were trying to introduce more agile working methods was have the ritual of the Kanban board every morning at 8:45, and that was quite countercultural at that point. You were going to say something?
No, but weekly it's only been introduced for 5 years or so.
Right. Right. Well, that's might be another useful cultural attribute that maybe people are taking notice of stuff that's being said, and that might be a sort of change in the culture. Also, notice that you've said in the last 5 years or so, because culture is really slow to change, and you generally can't do it by simply mandating a behaviour shift. You have to be able to underpin any change with structural change in systems or processes or performance measures or what have you. And an analogy is if you think about driving, we drive on the left-hand side, so you've all got the behaviours to drive on the right-hand side. There's no issue with the behaviours if we wanted to do that, and you do it when you go overseas. However, if we immediately one night some edict, you have to tomorrow drive on the right-hand side. The behaviours are all there to do it. The infrastructure wouldn't allow it because you've got everything set up for left-hand driving. And it's the same with culture change. You can't simply say, which a lot of culture change programs try and do, changing the behaviours. It doesn't work unless you also change supporting systems and processes for that behaviour. And so how you start to think about, if we want to change the power structures, what do we have to do? And there have been experiments around taking out some of the grades, for example, or one of the issues in the civil service is the differential between grade and pay and expertise. They're not meshed together properly. Any other questions or thoughts on this cultural web? No? Yes? Let's go back to that. Right, so done that. So often people talk about types of culture in terms of what I call a label. So they'll label their whole culture. So the Department for Transport or your project team is a culture of results or a culture of control or whatever. And that needs to be very carefully thought about, because if you actually think about your day-to-day working life, you're meeting multiple cultures every day. And you can start to see it if you look at this notion of islands of culture. So I see that the purple lanyard is the project delivery profession. So now you've got a culture of that profession. So you've got that you're identifying with your profession, not necessarily with your role or the organisation. And you can start to think, does profession trump organisation in cultural terms? And looking at what the civil service is trying to do, that could be a difficulty because they're putting everyone into professions. And at the same time, the individual departments are trying to maintain loyalty to the department because there's a lot of churn across departments for various reasons. So you've got two competing cultural ideas there. So when you think about who do I think about as my culture? Is it your profession? Is it your team culture? Is it your project culture? Is it your departmental culture? In your case, you've got a sort of mixed. Do I think I'm more allied to TfL, or in whose interest am I working? That sort of thing. And when you think about, this is just an example from a construction project. So there's a subculture of the executive team, and you do meet that. You have director meetings and you have deputy director meetings and what have you in the civil service. So that's a subculture. Now you've got in this construction project the engineer subculture, which equates to the project delivery subculture. And then in this example, you've got the operator ones, the contractors and procurement and what have you, who are keeping the whole thing together, and they'll have their own subcultures. So culture is much more granular and complex than a single label. And when you're thinking about the way that you have the facility to move between them, that's the sort of thing that you're trying when you're developing your own project team's culture, is to help people move between the cultures that they meet quite seamlessly. So when you go into a TfL meeting, you've sort of absorbed that culture and respond in it. And when you go back to your transport meeting, you're in that culture in your head, and they can be quite different. Any thoughts or comments on that islands of culture idea?
I think one of the things that affects us in this department is we sponsor some quite major projects.
Right.
And if our culture in the centre is different to the culture in the project we're sponsoring, it might not be signalled properly in terms of reports.
Oh, yes,
like
good.
that. You know, if you've got an organisation whose culture is, you must say everything is on track until the moment when it's not.
Yeah.
And it's reporting into a body like ours, where actually it's better to get it out in the open and say, do you know what, it's at risk now. You're going to get some coffee.
Yes. Yes. And what that illustrates is the need to be courageous and talk about all that before you start. You know, what are our norms of working together? What do we expect from each other? And I had an interesting experience quite early on in my career with a joiner. I was at British Airways at the time, and a senior level new joiner came in as a manager, and he showed me his 10 points. This is what I expect from my staff. So it had 10 points. I expect you to turn up on time. He was obsessed with filing. You can't leave the office till everything's filed. So it was that sort of level. But it was quite humorous at one level, but that's what he expected. But he also expected them to come back and say, this is what I expect from you as our manager. So that was a very open conversation. So he went in with his 10 points, this is what I expect from you. But they all met and said, this is what we want from you, both individually and collectively. And I thought that was a very courageous form of leadership. Because, you know, this filing thing, which made me laugh, he was absolutely adamant about it. It was long before computer stuff. But he did actually manage to create a very nice relationship with all his team members. And everybody understood what was going on all the time, and they could talk to each other about it. So, yes. Yes. Well, he came in new, so they didn't have any expectations of him. But there are ways, but that was one way that he instantly had learned somewhere online of building trust.
started and you're in it, you can't change.
That's right. Yes, that's right. You do get stuck. Yes, you can do resets sometimes, but again, that takes trust and courage. Yeah. Yeah. I sometimes, for another group, I have discussions on what is brave leadership. And that starts to take up that trust thing, because the brave leadership is really hard to do. And what's considered brave in one situation is utterly foolhardy in another situation. Okay, well, I must speed up. Right. I won't do that because we've sort of talked about, what did it say? Your tier members should be team members. What basis, depending on things like your management style, which is the thing that you're talking about, what is your management style, and how does your management style reflect what your team members are able to do? And the one way to think about that is to start reflecting on where you feel comfortable with certain managers. What are those project leaders doing, or what are the other team members doing, which help you feel that you're contributing effectively? The question that I often wonder about is, can you actually consciously design culture? Because you're in it. How can you change it or transform it or manipulate it differently if that's what you want to do? And Edgar Schein, I don't know if any of you know any of you know Edgar Schein? Yeah. Yes. So he's a very key cultural commentator. And he's got some delightful videos that you can see him talking about culture. This is a quote from an article. And I like his work because over the years he's changed his views. And that also, I think, is encouraging, because we're in a very different society now from 10 or 15 years ago. And he says that changing the culture is like trying to change your personality. You can imagine that if there's any aspects of it that you can change. And that's one of the things we're grappling with at DIT, because DIT is a mashup of 3 or 4 organisations and a whole bunch of newcomers who've never been in the civil service before. So you've got these sort of competing tribes, as people call them, and how do you forge a culture from that of one DIT? So if you are thinking of doing it, what do you actually do? We're not going to watch this because I didn't know how firm the video link would be, but the link is here, and I can send you and it's only 3 minutes, but it's Edgar Schein talking to Carl Moore on his now thoughts on culture. What you have to do, generally speaking, if you want to change something, is be incredibly clear what you're trying to change. And if any of you are following Ford several years ago, Mullally has left now, but when he joined, he noticed the sharp elbows and political game playing and what have you. And it's a bit like your thing about the RAG ratings of should you be open or should you say things that are going swimmingly. Because there's a terrifically good story that he told, and I heard it from his HR director, who I spoke to in one of the things I was writing. When he joined, there was this sharp elbows type culture, and he went to one of those red, amber, green meetings projects, and everybody's project was green, and so he didn't say anything. So he was new. He didn't say anything. Just that's fine. The next week he went to the same meeting, and everyone's RAG ratings throughout were green. So he didn't say anything. And then the third week he said, "Look, guys, we're losing $1 million per day. Not everything is green. I want the truth." And this was completely unheard of, because the previous CEO had wanted the green all the time. And the following week, there was, on all these dots, there was one amber dot. And Mullally said to the executive on that sheet, "Stand up, please." And he thought he was going to get a real rollicking. And Mullally said, "I want to cheer you on. You're the first brave leader that I've seen." And that set the tone for the whole change. which took 7 years. And he was completely, utterly intent on it. And interestingly, from a success point of view, Ford was the only car manufacturing company in the US which did not need a bailout in the crash. And it did reach the #1 spot of best-selling now. Since he's left, it's slipped back again, which demonstrates that committed leadership to your culture is one of the cultural attributes to be looking for. The way he did it, he had everybody have on the back of their the swipe card, have this thing that says 1 team, 1 plan, 1 goal, and then the expected behaviours. And every single meeting discussed this. So is what we're talking about contributing to 1 team? Is it contributing to 1 plan, etc.? And you can see that is quite a rigorous method of developing the culture and very, very thought through. And he was very interested in people. And so when you hear him talking, it's fascinating the way he talks about how important it is to bring your people with you. He couldn't just do it himself. So that leadership team meeting he had every week, one of the things he introduced, which again was well worth doing, was he invited 2 people to join the meeting from anywhere in the world on a lottery basis. So they could apply, and their name would just be pulled out of a hat each week. And then he would fly them in from wherever they were in the world to the executive team meeting to be observers and write a blog about it and talk about it. And that created a thing of inclusion. He wasn't thinking only people in America exist, it's a worldwide organisation. And any level, obviously, a person could apply. So some very nice things he did to show how committed he was to changing the culture of thought. But it did take a long time. And he was quite ruthless in some respects. If people wouldn't go along with the senior level, then they had to leave. So if you do want to think about designing your culture, you can be systematic about it. You can think about the whole organisation, your business unit or project, or the day-to-dayness. And you think about it in these 4 dimensions of the people, the work, the informal part of the organisation, and the formal part of the organisation. And you start to ask yourself questions. So if you're thinking about your own project, so if you call your whole project the whole organisation, what values and behaviours do we need? And then what do we need in the work streams within the project, which would be the business unit? And what are we doing in the day-to-day? And you then start to have discussions about that. And then where can we share things, or how can we adapt for group benefit, whatever it is. So this is a question set that takes you out of the just thinking about cultural behaviours into more of a whole way of thinking. It's a whole system way of thinking about cultural change. So just start to ponder that for a moment. Any thoughts on that? I'd rather a brief moment. Okay, why don't you talk to each other for a second or 2? I'm very conscious of people live streaming, but they're not getting the interaction inside. You might start to think, what would you change in your own project that you're working on right now in any of those things? Any of those questions? Any questions? correct the spelling out. Right, so any thoughts on these questions? Hmm? Oh yeah, good. That's what it's for. You can change the first column so that it reads project or whatever. But it basically shows you that culture is there at different levels in the organisation or different points. Any other questions or thoughts on this slide?
Yeah, I mean, this is all really well, but the real world is such that the pace of the direction and the sort of embedded team structures in order to truly influence this, I would argue that you need to be at SCS level in government.
Yes. So what do other people think though? Sorry, I interrupted. Yeah.
Based on knowledge, experience, and so forth, and I think that it needs political buy-in.
That's right. Yes.
Otherwise, not being an organisation sort of mixed up, such as yourself, just corporate culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
We need this lecture to be given at political level, but the views we are of the civil service are agents of the politicians. So in order to truly change the civil service, the politicians must understand this landscape.
That's right. And I think that one of the other things that struck me when I joined the civil service is these discussions. I found a document from 1968 which says more or less the same thing. It is systemic and difficult to change. What were you going to say?
I think it's regardless of people that you stuck with, say 20 people that you don't know.
That's right.
And you feel that one person trying to change the other people is a lot more difficult than changing your own behaviour. And it's probably a little bit of a tough task sometimes to get the 20 people to change their behaviours to do things the way you want.
Yes,
yeah. And I think this gets lost sometimes in organisations more diverse organisations, but obviously the broader the thinking and the harder it is to come to some sort of central culture that's not very, very bland and functional.
Yeah, and you can use these questions to have those discussions. Because one way, and it takes a tremendously long time to change, quite often.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean don't have a go at it if you want to change it, because recognizing that it's hard and recognizing that it takes transparency and good communication is step one. And that was the thing about Mullally, is he knew it would be hard, so he'd allocated him mentally 7 to 10 years, and he could only say after 7 years it was a joke. But he knew it would be hard, but he was quite, as I said, at points quite ruthless about it. And having that in mind, I think that the SCS thing is worth thinking about because all of us are sat in the bigger context that you've already mentioned, and where you can exercise power is useful to ask yourself, because there are lots and lots of sources of power. And another program that I go to the MOD and talk about organisation design, and that has a list of 14 different sources of power. And so you've got expert power, and you've got resource power, and you've got positional power is one of them. But there are lots of ways you can exercise power which can work with the positional power. And in the expert versus position, that can be quite powerful if you can make it work. It requires the person with the positional power to admit that they don't know, which is, but yeah, and that can take courage for that person as well. And so you can see that there are these sort of what I call systemic issues, and there are personal, behavioural, emotional responses to things. One of the things that I was trying to do when I was working, I worked in America for 13 years. And I did a huge project with the General Services Administration on moving people from head office building to a new building and then back to a refurbished office building, where they had to go from, in the head office building, they had offices and positional sort of stuff like red carpet if you're the administrator, and that's the Home Secretary equivalent. And then various grades of stuff that you could get on various grades, which was, I find amusing, but they loved it. And in the new building, it was a completely open plan like this, in the refurbished one, and then moved to flexible working. But one of the things that really struck me, because my role was to help people manage from this old building to new building, sort of emotional, was one person said to me, I said, "You're not going to have an office, you're going to be an open plan like everybody else." And he said to me, "How will people know I'm important then?" And I thought that was so intriguing, that because it had never struck me that people would value what to me is of no particular value. But that really was a very good lesson for me, because what it showed me was that people have completely different concepts of what they're interested in. And to cut that long story short, I commissioned a piece of academic research on what happens if you take away people's symbols of power. And it was very, very interesting, the response. I can send you the case study if you're interested. Because what the researchers found was that then if you removed a symbol of power without that person wanting it to be removed, or going along with it at least, then they would start to behave in unacceptable ways, because you'd change their kind of psychological contract with the organisation. And I've always borne that in mind since then, as you start to change things, that particularly around these cultural artifacts, how careful you have to be in working with people's sensitivities, because they're not going to tell you. He actually, who did tell me, represented, as I found out, a lot of people, but he was willing to say it.
But how much do you find it all relates back to this David before, if you're losing money and your company is going to go down, and you're going to really lose your job, and you can focus people's purpose a lot more, and then obviously get a lot more buying from someone, and someone with changing offices and all. How much does purpose, cultural purpose, feed into all of this?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, there's a ton of academic research around it and there's a good website called the Purpose-Driven Organisation. And a lot of people think that purpose is more important than values, because you can unite behind a common purpose, and you don't have to then share values, and that can be quite helpful particularly in a project thing. You can forget your individual organisational values and say our collective purpose is whatever it is. You have to just be a little bit careful. When I worked for Xerox at one point, and at the point I worked with, the purpose was get Canon. So every single person just knew that they had to just get Canon, which they succeeded in. And whether that was good or bad, that it was a success. Subsequently, I worked for Marks and Spencer, and the purpose there was to exceed 1 billion in turnover, which they also achieved, but at huge cost. and it wasn't done in a way that would brought people along with them and sort of fostered the organisation and resulted in that entire M&S executive team leaving at that point.
Is that under rules?
Yes, and if you read the there's a very good kind of autobiography of Marks and Spencer, but written by a journalist, called The Rise and Fall of Marks and Spencer, that documents all of this because it's had a very rocky path, Marks and Spencer. Okay, we're getting towards the end now. So if you do want to design your culture or change your culture or build a culture from scratch, if you've got a new project, what do you do then? So here, this is from DWP. We had this thing when Kevin Cunnington was there of creating a delivery culture. So he wanted everybody to have a delivery culture around projects. And so we had this poster up on the wall, work in the open, share not, and it was very, very countercultural. And what was the most countercultural was those 3 arrows of don't wait for permission, which you can imagine the discussions that we've had today. Not waiting for permission is a countercultural attribute to try and encourage in the civil service. People, not resources. So think about the people and the relationships rather than the task and how you're going to get the money for that. And then build strong communities. And the build strong communities is around the project success in this particular instance and the delivery culture, rather than your allegiance to your profession or to your piece of the organisation. So if you start to think about how we're going to get those cultural attributes, what can you do? And there are lots and lots of tools that help you with getting to this sort of thing. And what comes next is just 3 types of tools which are all available.
The second one, share not send, is that about emails?
Yes, that's right. Yes. So why don't you just go and talk to someone rather than, which is really good because I wasn't necessarily thinking about this in that way this morning. But this morning I thought, right, I must send an email to see if I can get some money for a learning program that I'm working. And then I thought, I've got to pop into the office. And then I saw the person with the money and I just ran up to her and said, have you got any money for this? And she just said yes, which saved endless amounts of going to and fro. And that picking up the phone is often a lot quicker. And one of the things that Kevin encouraged us all to do is, if you're sitting next to someone, for goodness sake, don't send them an email. That's right, yes, exactly. Yeah. So that's where the people, not resources, starts to come into play. Don't use the technology if you can approach a person. And because that approaching the person builds the personal relationship. Exactly.
You no longer know where someone might be. So actually send an email instead of dropping them to their desk, which you might have done and you know where the desk was. So
yes, that's right. But there are some methods of you could call them, or you can send WhatsApps, which was what we started to do. But some of those methods are then become intrusive. You know, people turn off their WhatsApp thing on the phone because they can't stand being interrupted. So in that sense, we're all learning how to get the personal touch with the technology, which I think is quite a hard task for us as we all learn that. And the other way that we've done it in various organisations that I work with is foster the personal touch. Like, you know, you set up these, in DWP we had coffee roulette. So you just put everyone's name on an Excel spreadsheet and then you pull one off and then I saw what someone piece of the team has introduced over at DIT is everybody's name is in a hat, as it were, plastic jar. And as you walk past, you pull one out and go and say good morning to them. And that's quite fun if they're in the office. They put their name in the hat when they come into the office. I think that's how it works. So you know that they're in the office. And then the next person pulls them out. So that's quite a good way. So there are various sort of manufactured methods of getting that. Right. So the ways that you can start to think about it, there are tools in all of these. So the methods of developing the supportive infrastructure, which is I've mentioned a few times. So just think driving on the left, driving on the right, what infrastructure has to change? You know you've got the behaviors. If you change the context, you change the habits, like moving everyone from a closed office environment to open plan will change your habits. So that is useful to think about. You can actually shape the group norms through incentives. And you could say, you know, the person who's met 3 new people this week gets a free cup of coffee from whatever. You know, so there's those sorts of incentives. You can take away the old rules, and that's quite difficult to do, but because you have to recognise that you've got them. And one of the ones related to SCS rules is you could open all meetings to everybody. Why do we have deputy director meetings, grade 7 meetings, etc.? Why don't we just have a meeting about a topic? That's right, yeah. So if you had issues-based meetings rather than grade-based meetings, that could be for relaxing the old rules and controls. And you could demonstrate yourself some of these cultural attributes. So here's a selection of methods that you may already be working with. And then the tools, you start to see them on the other side, incentives, symbols, etc. And then now you've got some examples. These are, what's coming up now is 3 slides of just 3 types of examples. So don't wait for permission, people not resources, and building strong communities. And then you've got don't wait for permission. You can start to use this. It's a bit muffled or some of it, but you'll get it and you can look it up online. You can do a little flow chart of making sure that people don't wait for permission, that they just start taking actions themselves. If they don't ask for permission and they get it wrong, you can't then penalise them. And there's a terrific thing that happened last week. I don't know if you saw it on Twitter, but I loved it. So there's this restaurant called Hawksmoor, steak place, I think. And some new person to the organisation misread a wine bottle label and sold a 4,500 bottle of wine to a customer for £12. But Hawksmoor did not immediately sack the person. They put a great big Twitter thing out saying, everybody makes mistakes, don't worry about it, we love you anyway. And that's the most fantastically good cultural message, and how reassuring for the person. And you know, there is this thing about if you say don't ask for permission, you have to then accept that people might do something that you don't particularly like, but you can't then penalise them for it because that would be a disconnect. Then there's this idea of failing forward. This is a very, very good website, this Fail Forward. They've got a mass of resources on thinking ahead, taking ideas from people, the idea of intelligent failure, what are we learning, and a lot of discussion and blogs on working through that. And then the third one is the building strong communities, and this is from the Voice of Scotland, which has got a very good record of building communities through Scotland. Which, to that your point about dispersion, Scotland is very dispersed community, but this method that they use builds cohesion across different, you know, crofting communities and what have you. So there's a lot of different tools that you can use to develop some of these ideas. And I did write a blog piece called A Toolkit of Toolkits, which if you look at my website, you can pick up. At the moment, there's 15 different toolkits, which again expands on some of these things. So over to you, right, so we've got about, I'm going to extend it by 5 minutes, 2 minutes left to discuss with each other what actions you're going to take to promote culture, you or your project, or you'd like to see? What are the next 2 actions or 3 actions you're going to take? So if you could just discuss them with each other from what we've learned so far. You've already got one that you're going to use that slide. So. Okay. Any actions that people are willing to share with each other? Oh, communicate the product. Yeah, feel free to do that. I'll correct the spelling error and send it to Molly, and along with the links for the various other things. Good, thank you. Anything else?
I thought it was funny because he didn't recognize them.
Right. Okay, good. Great. Any others that people want to share?
Also on the inclusion point, we have a executive community
Right.
in our project, and we've already had something that members in the team that we feel quite confused.
Oh, right.
I
Okay.
feel that's a really
Yeah. Or having reps attend it or something. Yeah.
Or even
Absolutely.
having it more as
Yes.
expertise
Yes.
rather than grade.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Or issue. That can work really well. Okay. Any other ideas? Just so as you think over this over the next few hours or days, other ideas will come to you. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you for your attendance, which has been great. And if you want to contact me, at the end of the slide deck, there's my trade email, my Twitter thing, and my website, which has got the various blogs on. I write a weekly blog, and a phone number. So several methods to contact me.
Thank you so much, Naomi.
You're very welcome.
I thoroughly enjoyed the session. I really liked the interactive elements to it. I think it worked really well. As being a smaller group, I think we're really privileged to have had the session with you. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
There'll be a feedback survey sent out to attendees, so look out for that in your inbox. Is there anything else I meant to say, Molly? Okay. So thank you very much, Naomi.
You're welcome. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Yeah.